Hello YouTube, it's DasGregor. It's 2020, a new year, and hopefully you'll be seeing more content from me. Today, we're going to talk about something slightly controversial. Something so groundbreaking that there are people lining up on both sides of the fence to say, that is not the Gentoo way, that is not the Gentoo method, and others saying, hallelujah. But first, let's talk about my first experiences with Gentoo. If you don't want to, you can go fast forward. But I wanted to give you a basis of understanding as to where I'm coming to or coming from in regards to this new interesting idea. I've been running Gentoo since 2003. I first was introduced to Linux, I think around 98. I think Caldera was one of the first Linux versions that I threw down and got to a command line interface and said, ooh, wow, now what? I'm lost. I checked out Red Hat. I remember Mandrake. Thinking SUSE was around, definitely Slackware. But one thing that I always had problems with, one thing that really frustrated me, was that I could never get my hardware to work 100% with any distribution that I was trying to run at the time. And it was really difficult sometimes just to get a desktop manager to function. And coming from a Windows background, I didn't really know how to do too much in the command line interface. Now, granted, I had been working with computers since the early 80s. My father had purchased an Osborne 1. I started learning to do basic programming as a kid, some assembly, learning how to work on a CP/M system. So we had that, and then we went to a 286. I bought my first 486 in 93, and that was my own system with Windows 3.1. My first desktop, you might say, because before that I was just running everything out of DOS. So I'm not completely unfamiliar with the command line interface, but it was still something new. I wasn't familiar with Unix or Linux, that's for sure. But when I would get everything functioning, it always seemed like something just didn't work right. I couldn't get it to do what I needed it to do. And then I found Gentoo. And most likely I probably found Gentoo from a magazine that I really enjoyed back then. It's still around, Linux Format. They would always have a CD back then, and eventually I think they moved to DVDs. And they always had the distro of the month or a few different flavors to test out. And I found Gentoo. And so I tried Gentoo. And I went through the handbook and I installed it. Now you guys, I tell you, nowadays you might think Gentoo is difficult. You're using a stage 3 tarball. Back then, let me tell you, we used a stage 1 tarball and we had to build the bootstrap, build the utilities, and build everything from the ground up. That was a lot harder and a lot more time consuming. You had a lot more invested in your Gentoo build back then. But when I did it, and when I finished, and for those of you, did you really succeed on your first try? No, I didn't. I think it was probably my third, fourth. I even may have installed it, failed, and said, this is just too difficult. I'll come back to it. But I did. I came back to it. Something about it just kept drawing me back to Gentoo. It's one of those distributions of Linux that just clicked for me. I understood it. It took a little bit to grasp everything, but when I did, I liked what I saw. And for the first time, when I successfully built my kernel, configuring everything that I needed inside the kernel for the hardware that was specific to the system that I had, that satisfaction of being able to boot into Linux and have everything 100% working on that old 2002 single processor, I think it was just a Pentium, but everything worked. All those other flavors that I tried, the distributions, they just didn't have it complete. Now, I'm not bashing them in any way, shape, or form. You got to remember back then there wasn't a huge development out there, and people weren't developing Linux to work on every plausible piece of hardware. You really had to have your system kind of built or put together to work for Linux instead of Linux working for your system. Things have changed. Things have changed a lot over the years. But one of the greatest things that that gave me was a real good understanding for how Linux works, functions under the hood, as well as just making or using. I understood I was learning to maintain it. And that's what really gave me that great understanding. Now, a couple of years ago, I installed Linux from scratch, and I've done that 2 or 3 times. And if you really want to learn Linux, if you really want to do everything, maybe the hard way, but also the way that you're going to understand it better, I suggest everybody try to open up a virtual box or something like that and go through the Linux from scratch handbook. You're really going to get the nuts and bolts of Linux by doing Linux from scratch. And I even, like I said, I did that a couple years ago, and I used it as my main OS there for a short time just because I was having so much fun with it. I didn't do anything too fancy, but it worked and it was great, and it taught me even a lot just a few years ago. I'm always learning something new with Gentoo, and it really helped that I learned how to build my kernel back then and to customize it for the hardware that I have today. Now you fast forward 17 years later, it's 2020. It's a new era. The question I pose, do you really gain anything in 2020 by installing your operating system from source code, by building your kernel from scratch? I tend to cringe anytime I have to touch the kernel. Once I get a kernel built that's functioning and working really well with the hardware that I have, I don't tend to update it. I don't tend to do anything because I don't want to mess up what I know is functioning well. That's always a scary thing for me to think about. But like I said, it's 2020. And now Gentoo, in its portage, has a vanilla kernel binary. Yes, you heard me right. A vanilla kernel binary. Now, I've done a little bit of research, not much. I have installed it. I'm not running it on my main box, but I do have it installed. It did work perfectly fine in the Gentoo virtual machine that I've recently built. So it is plausible. It is there. It is real. Now, this is what I say. People say, it's not the Gentoo way. No. Yeah, Gentoo was building everything from scratch, compiling it and setting it up for your specific needs. But the question I pose is, are we in an area of our technology that we really need to build the kernel from ground up? What are we gaining by doing such? The binary is going to give you everything you need. Now, some say, well, fine, if you're not going to build your kernel the manual method, then use GenKernel. Why do you need a binary? GenKernel, yeah, I use GenKernel all the time. When I build a VM, I'm not going to build my kernel from scratch. I'm just going to install the Gentoo sources. I'm going to install GenKernel. I'm going to run GenKernel all and just let it do it for me. I'm not going to spend that time. Now, yes, the init RAM OS can be a little bloated. The kernel might be a little bit bigger. but it's going to function, and I don't need to go into all of that. Almost 20 years ago, it made a big difference to compile the code and to tweak it to get that best performance. But in days of the cores, the threading that we have, the speed, the RAM, we're talking micro nanoseconds of improvement that we will never see with terabytes of hard drive space. Does it really matter if our kernel is 3 or 4 megs smaller because we built it from scratch with just the things we need? Recently, and in the last video, I talked about Docker. And I was going to install Docker on my Gentoo main system because I really wanted to learn it. And then I looked at the Docker Gentoo wiki and I saw all of the kernel updates I was going to have to do so that Docker could work. And I said, no, thank you. I don't want to get in there and mess with that because I'm probably going to mess something up. I'm not afraid of the kernel. It's just that when it's working great, I don't want to mess with it. And in the VM that I created, I also tried Docker because since I used the gen-kernel method, I was curious if all of the necessary kernel modules were already built within gen-kernel. And I found no, there were still about a half a dozen or so, maybe a little less, of tweaking that I needed to do. I did it just to try it out, see how it would work with the gen-kernel, and it wasn't difficult. It functioned, and I was able to get it working. And Docker works now in the Gentoo virtual machine, so it wasn't too difficult. But my point is, are we really getting that great of a performance boost? Now, if RAM is an issue, if hard drive space is an issue, if every ounce of power you need out of your machine is an issue, then yes, you're going to want to build it from the ground up, and you're going to want to tweak it to the point where it is the leanest, meanest, best kernel you can have. But for the specs of today, is it really necessary? I like the idea of Gentoo going to a binary kernel. I also very much enjoy the fact that there has always been that gen-kernel method too, for those of weak of heart, to be able to get a kernel built and running. But I am slightly envious of other distributions where they just have a kernel that works, that has everything that functions, and I'm not so much worried about how much disk space it's taking, or the fact that my system might take 3 seconds longer to load the kernel instead of being able to load it in 2.5 seconds of speed faster. It just, is it really worth it? So let's move over to here. This is the blog I wanted to talk about. Mikal. I hope I said your name right. I don't know if it's Mikal or Mikal. I apologize. I have seen some of the things you've been doing with the Gentoo distribution, and I thank you for that if you're watching this. But you have a blog here about the binary, the pros and cons, and I think you're going in the right direction. I think that this is a great route. In today's society, I'm not so sure there's that much of a need to install the kernel from scratch or from source. I think it's a great learning tool. I think it's a wonderful method to have. And that's the one thing I hope Linux never goes away from. Don't take away my choices. Give me the opportunity to build the kernel from source. Use the gen kernel. And if I'm super lazy, let me have a binary. That is awesome. Now, in his blog, there are some that post that, oh, please, no, that's not the Gentoo method. That's not the Gentoo way. I can understand that. There are parts of me that say, it's got to be hard, it's got to be tough. If it's not tough and hard, it's not worth doing because it's not the Gentoo way. But then there are parts of me that say, why am I taking 10, 12, 20 hours to do a world update? Last month, Perl got updated. When I updated Perl, I had over 800 and, well, closer to 900 packages that needed to be updated. My system took 12 hours to build all those packages and all the things that need to be updated. And I've been trying to be better. I think it only been 2 or 3 weeks since the last time I did a world update. I made a mistake of waiting too long one time, and it took forever, and it broke a lot of things that I had to try to figure out and tweak. And that kind of brings me to binary versus source. I have a little computer. It's actually the one that I built LFS on. And I threw Ubuntu on a little over a year ago so my wife could use it because her system had crashed and we were in the middle of getting her some new hardware. But it was something for her just to jump in and be able to utilize. I've left Ubuntu on there because it's easy, it's lightweight, it just functions. And recently I wanted to do some testing, so I pulled it out and I hadn't had it turned on for probably 6 to 8 months, maybe more. And before I did anything, I said, let's do an apt update, apt upgrade, etc. Oh my goodness. Over 600 packages needed to be updated on this now too. It's going to take me forever. And about 15 minutes later, it's like, what? Huh? You're done? You're working? You're good? Reboot. Surely it's going to crash. Yeah, it's just too many packages, binary packages of all things. It's going to crash. No, everything's good. Everything's working. Wow. Wow. Those 600 packages with Gentoo would have taken me hours and hours, depending upon which those packages were. I mean, honestly, a package update with just 4 or 5 can ruin your day if it's a WebKit that takes 2 to 3 hours to rebuild. That alone. Even myself, I've gotten a little lazy. I don't install LibreOffice from source. I install the binary. There's a couple things that actually I've started installing the binary. And this is the next topic. Before we move to it, I would like to say in my Gentoo VM, if I didn't already mention, I recently built that. I installed the kernel binary, the vanilla-kernel binary. The first time I did try it, it failed. There is something inside of the post. If we look at Drakut, let's see if we can find that real fast. It's not that one. It is this one here. Someone had mentioned how when they tried it, it failed the compilations, and it was stated right here that you need to use version 049-R3. Now, as of right now, January 2nd, 3rd, because I did this yesterday and I was testing it out, you do definitely need to make sure that you do and accept keywords and install Drakut version 049-R3. -R2 will fail. So if you want to try this, I suggest you do it in a virtual machine, not on your main machine. However, in that virtual machine, after I installed it, I did run the grub update. It saw both kernels without any problem. The original Gentoo kernel that I built with the Gen kernel, and of course the vanilla binary. It did log in. It did work. Now, because I was in the vanilla, I could not build the VirtualBox guest editions, and probably because it's the binary, it doesn't install the source. You'd still need to install the source package, and I haven't gotten that far. But most likely if I did that, I could then rebuild the VirtualBox guest editions to work off of that. And so it does work. It does function. I'm not so sure. I know it's still in testing, so there might not be everything fully working, or there might be some bugs. But so far, I've only tested it for a couple hours, and it seems to be pretty good right now. The whole point that I was looking at was, does it install? And yes, you do have to accept, I think, 3 or 4 packages, add them to your accept keywords to make them work. And this is why I say I'm not so sure I would do it in your main system, but it was kind of fun to do inside of a virtual machine just to test it. It installed much faster even than Gen-kernel. And of course, since you didn't have to touch anything, it just worked. And that goes to like I started to talk about, and I want to go now to this subject. Source versus binary. I've been fighting this idea for a few years now because it takes so long to do updates. Am I really gaining anything in 2020 by compiling my operating system from source? Now, Gentoo still has one thing that really makes it so powerful. That's their use flags. Being able to set the use flags on an application and build it for exactly how you need it built is the strongest, best way to get something and have that control, and that works. Now, in the past, I've always said I like source-based builds over binary-based builds because when I'm doing my emerge, if a package fails, I normally can find why the failure, whether it's the dependency or if it's a library that's missing, something that's there. And I can usually fix it by looking at the error log and having it move on. Now, that being said, over the last couple of years, Gentoo has been so stable, so strong, I've not had those kind of problems. I feel confident in starting a large update world or merge of world and going to bed and waking up in the morning and saying, yep, everything is awesome. Everything's working, everything's good, let's reboot, make sure everything is functioning. The problem I had with binary distributions in years past was that instead of a binary checking properly as to whether you have the right version of a dependency or if everything is going to work properly, it just lays down the files. It just, in essence, takes a bunch of files, in my opinion, lays them down, and then when you reboot, you have the tendency, a lot of times I found, for your system just to crash. And no real good way for you to figure out what went wrong, what package did not install correctly and why didn't it install. At least when I would install from source, I would see the errors. It would, a lot of times if it was missing things, the /configure that it would do would pop up and say, oh, you're running too old a version of such and such, and for some reason portage or emerge didn't pull in the dependency to upgrade that package, that dependency. And in a binary world, it's just so much harder, in my opinion. Now, this goes back to what I've talked about in the past, about finding a distribution that clicks for you. You got to find that one that works, that you understand, that you can grasp. Not every distribution is meant for everyone. Gentoo isn't meant for everyone. I'm getting lazy. I'm getting old. I'm kind of getting tired of compiling everything and it taking me hours when I can go to a Ubuntu system and I can say install Docker and voila, Docker is ready to go in seconds. Whereas I do the same thing with Gentoo and all right, I've got 30-40 minutes of compiling. Oh no, the kernel needs to be updated and changed, and well, that's going to lose me another 30 to an hour depending. How long it's going to take to rebuild the kernel, reboot, check to make sure everything's working, and then move forward. Sometimes I do miss that simple, easy. Now, some people have said to me, DOS. If you moved to a binary system like Ubuntu, you'd be bored. You wouldn't know what to do with it. Honestly, I'd like to have something that just works. I'm getting tired of tinkering. But on the same side, Gentoo has always clicked for me. I understand it. It's great. Yes, there are times I cringe when I do a world update, but I've really enjoyed Gentoo. Having this vanilla binary is going to be nice. You don't have to use it. You have the choice of Gen-kernel, and you have the choice of building your kernel manually. That's the thing that I have always enjoyed most about Linux in general. The choice you have, the freedom you have to use what you want and to have it all available to you. There's no one out there saying, this is the app you've got, love it or leave it, I don't care. Because in Linux, if you look at the app and you don't like it, you say, what else is out there? And you find 3 or 4 other alternatives that you can try out and check and work with. And then you find that one that works best for you and you keep it. You treasure it. And you hope that they never stop supporting it. I do have some applications that have been supported in over 13 years, but I still use them on a regular basis because they still function, they still work. And I really would like them to get updated or find an alternative solution in today's tech age that would be a viable replacement, but people haven't done that for some of the applications I'm looking at. I wish I had the knowledge and the know-how to do my own programming to make some of these work and function so that maybe they're a little bit more secure into today's programming, but that's off topic. So what do you guys think? Are you guys excited about the fact that they're building a vanilla binary that you could just install? Of those of you watching that use Gentoo, maybe you actually use some of my old tutorials in the last years to help you understand and build Gentoo for the first time. Or maybe you've been doing Gentoo for the last 2 decades, almost 2 decades, that it's been around and you've always enjoyed it, but you remember those hard days to the way it is today. The thing I like is the fact that you can still always download in any distribution the kernel source and install it from scratch if you really wanted to and build it from scratch. You don't have to use a distro's specific, although a lot of times they put their own little updates in there that maybe it might not work so well depending on how they've tweaked it, but you always have that choice. I like the idea that I could install it and tweak it. You can use Gen-kernel and tweak it too and still let it build for you and not have to worry about whether or not you mess something up. Or now you've got the option for a vanilla kernel binary. How cool is that? So what do you guys think? If it's morning, evening, noon, or night, hope I haven't rambled too much in this one, but enjoy it, and thank you for watching. Bye, guys.